Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Jared with Scholastic Lutherans, sitting here with Nathan Greeley, the author of this book, Christian Apologetics, A Lutheran Introduction. We're really excited to have him back on. He earlier had a discussion with us about Philip Melanchthon, and that was a great video we had. So wonderful to have him back with us. Before I begin, tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Greeley, for those who don't know of your work as well. Just your background, what you do now.
Well, I was not raised Lutheran. I grew up as a Baptist and became a Lutheran in my 30s after spending some time in an Anglican church. And I've just really immersed myself in Lutheran theology and the Lutheran understanding of things since that time. And that's enabled me to achieve a modicum of understanding of what Lutheranism is all about. And it's definitely something that I deeply appreciate and that I find a tremendous amount of value in. So I'm very grateful to be Lutheran. I'm very grateful that I was able to discover Lutheranism and the resources that it has and the riches that it has. For me personally, that's been a great blessing. So I'm continuing to learn. I teach apologetics for the American Association of Lutheran Churches at their seminary. And I also teach philosophy classes for Indiana Wesleyan University. My day job, however, is to teach at a classical Christian school in Kokomo, Indiana.
I actually didn't know some of that. I didn't know that you taught philosophy at Wesleyan University, and I knew about your AALC,
Mm-hmm.
your teaching there. I also didn't know about the classical Christian school. That's actually really interesting. Um, and I knew you were Anglican at one point. I wasn't sure if it was Episcopalian, like a more
It
conservative, or at least
was.
a
It was a
okay.
more, well, I was looking for a conservative Anglican church.
Right.
And this is like back when I was in my uh, early 30s. And the, um, the church that I found appeared to be what I was looking for, and it happened to be an Episcopal church. As it turned out, it really wasn't as conservative as I thought and as I
Mm,
wanted it to be. And so eventually, I was there for a few years, and then I ended up leaving and going to the LCMS because the LCMS had a lot of the things that I was looking for in Anglicanism, but it didn't have a lot of the baggage or a lot of the drawbacks of Anglicanism.
yep.
So that was basically explains, I think, a lot about how I came to be a Lutheran, is that I was attracted to what was good in Anglicanism, had trouble finding an actual place to worship in the Anglican tradition that was suitable for me from a theological standpoint, from a and in terms of its practices. And so the LCMS made a lot of sense, coming to things from that direction.
Yeah, I have a similar background. I don't talk about it as much, but I
Mm-hmm.
grew up evangelical, and then when I was in college, end of high school, early college, I was also looking into Anglicanism. And effectively, what happened was I met Seth, the other guy that runs the
Mm-hmm.
channel with me, and everything I liked about Anglicanism, I found in Lutheranism, and it was a bit, I suppose you could say, stricter in a good way, in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
when I was an Anglican, I pretty much affirmed Lutheran doctrines, but I would be with people who are affirming more like Reformed doctrines, or I even know some Zwinglians that are in the Anglican community. And I'm definitely not a Zwinglian, so
Right.
that's kind of what left me. But I owe immense respect for Anglicans. There's some great stuff they have. So,
Yeah, my theology hasn't didn't change that much.
mhm.
Like I said, it was more I think what attracted me to Anglicanism was just it was more familiar, and um, for a lot of Americans, especially ones that don't grow up in the Midwest or grow up, in German families, Lutheranism is something that's more peculiar or just more unknown. Um,
Yep.
so Anglicanism seems maybe to be more accessible, but what I came to realize after becoming an Anglican and then also taking a look at Lutheranism when I was trying to figure out where else I was going to go, is that the similarities there are a lot of striking similarities, but I think whenever there's a difference, the Lutherans always going to get the better of things, like they end up coming out on the right side of things. So for me, it was it was a good thing that things that the Anglican Church didn't really provide what I was looking for, because that kind of pushed me to keep going and to get to a place that was much better in my view.
Yeah, that's about makes sense to me. Um, well, how about we move on to today's topic?
Mm-hmm.
So you wrote this book that I showed earlier. The camera, there we go, zoomed in. Christian Apologetics, Lutheran Introduction. Was this in 2021, 2019? I can't quite recall when it was
It was
published.
written in the fall of 2020, and then it was published
Okay.
about 10 months later, or I guess about a year later,
Okay.
actually. Yeah.
hmm Yeah. So regardless, it's pretty recent when you think about it. Even though that's, almost 2 years ago now, it's weird to say. Um, it still is pretty recent, and I'm sure it's getting more traction as time goes on. People have to get more familiar with it, and that's why we have you on the show.
Thank
Um,
you.
so with that, so with that in mind, there are so many apologetics books out there. I have, Norman Geisler's his Christian Apologetics. I have his second volume. I thought that one was really good. Of course, even though we disagree with William Lane Craig on a lot of stuff, his Foundations for Christian Philosophy or
Mhm.
something, I think it's called that. There's
Yeah.
that. There's a ton of stuff from various apologists. And then you added your own. So can you tell us what exactly distinguishes your book from the other apologetics books that are out there?
Well, I guess let me start off by just saying a few things about like what led to my
Sure,
writing.
please.
I was preparing a course of lectures, and so I was getting notes ready. And as I was generating these notes, I started to think, well, it would be pretty easy to turn this into a book. And the lecture course was going to be a class introducing apologetics for Lutherans. So that was the target audience. That was, kind of the level that I was intending it to be pitched at, was something that would be easy to understand, something that would um, resonate with Lutherans, something that would make sense to them, something that would be consistent with the Lutheran tradition and the Lutheran confessions. So that was what it got me writing, or what initially inspired me to start writing this book. I had thought for a while that I might write an apologetics book at some point in the future, but wasn't really planning on doing it now or a few years, earlier from in the past. Um,
Yeah.
3 years ago, I wasn't planning on doing it. But what ended up happening is that I started writing these notes and kind of organizing them and getting them together, and realizing that the way that I was structuring it, I thought other people might appreciate it, or other people might like what I was doing. So I ran it by Jordan Cooper. I shared the manuscript with him. It all came together pretty quickly. I wrote the whole thing probably in about a month or two.
Oh, wow.
And he thought it was pretty good. I mean, I think that it would serve a purpose if it were published. So at that point, it's just a matter of getting the copy editor to look at it and things like that. But what distinguishes it, I would say, is that it's very concise. It attempts to be brief. It attempts to kind of just deal with essential things, right? So anything that's kind of extraneous or superfluous, it's going to try to avoid those things, because it doesn't want to be a big book. The whole intention was to make something very brief, something that people could get through in a day or two or three at the most. A quick read, something that might get people thinking about things differently, or plant some new ideas, so that people would be helped when they're doing evangelism or when they're witnessing to people that they know. So I was writing it primarily for people in my church. I was thinking about what they would want from a book on this subject. Like what kind of a book would they actually pick up and actually finish, or get through all the way, and what kind of a book would they find interesting and not too dull, or too that got too deep into things, right? So I wanted to make sure that it was something that normal lay people could appreciate. So it wasn't really written for pastors. If a pastor reads it and likes it, that's great. But it was definitely written for the average churchgoer who has not read many books in this area, if any, in the past, just to kind of get them to kind of have hopefully some better answers to the kinds of questions that they might be getting from coworkers or from family members or friends and things like that. Another thing that makes it maybe a bit different is that it's written from a more or less of a Thomistic perspective. So philosophically, that's where I'm at, or that's my primary influence when it comes to thinking about metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and things like that. So that informs kind of the basic approach to the issues in terms of how I structure things, the kinds of arguments that I employ, and the assumptions that I make at the beginning. So those all kind of come from classical philosophy or from the Thomistic tradition, which, I realize all Lutherans are maybe not going to be too excited about that or too keen on that because, Thomas has kind of an ambiguous reception, by Lutherans. But I do think that when it comes to apologetics, I think he's a great resource. And I think that Lutherans will only benefit by taking him very seriously and engaging with him. So I think the fact that the book is informed a lot by his thinking is a positive thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it helps to create a good book. And the other thing that I'll mention is that my intention, like I've already said, is that I wanted everything in there to be consistent with the Lutheran confessions. So a lot of apologetics books you read, they might, parts of them might be compatible with what Lutherans believe, but a lot of them probably won't be, right? Or there'll probably be things here and there that just don't really sit well with what we hold to be true about different things. So for that reason, I thought the book also, was worth writing because I thought that would help. It would help people to have an apologetics resource written from that point of view that is not going to confuse them or maybe, lead them to think along lines that actually are not actually consistent with what they want to profess and confess as Lutherans.
Yeah. All of those things I agree with because obviously I read the book for the interview and I took note of all those things that I really appreciated. So I often find that a lot of it's almost like you have one or the other. You either have thorough scholastic philosophy or you have a concise book. Like I find that a
Mhm.
lot. For
Yeah. Mhm.
apologists, like it's not as easy to discuss apologetics from the framework of, say, a Thomist or a Scotist or even, say, a Suarezian, um, because there's such a rich metaphysical background. But you did
Mhm.
really well in setting up what I think are really the only necessary assumptions for this task. I also
Yeah,
really love.
I definitely didn't
Sorry?
want the book to also be like an introduction to
Right.
mystic philosophy because that would be like totally
Exactly.
besides the point, right? So
Right.
those things are working in the background, but I do elucidate them to the extent that it's necessary to understand, I
Exactly.
think, yeah, what's being said.
Yeah. And one thing I really appreciated, well, there were, I mean, there were several things, but two of the things I really appreciated in this respect was that you actually used, I remember the arguments for God's existence that you used were citations from Gerhard. I was really impressed by that. I really liked that. Um,
Well,
because I think
I
it both
was impressed
shows,
by Gerhardt. I was
well,
impressed by
yes.
Gerhardt just borrowing them from Thomas. So that made things pretty easy for me, right? Um,
Yep.
I want to present an apologetics book for Lutherans that looks at things from a Thomistic point of view And here I have, wow, this Lutheran scholastic Gerhard that basically just borrowed all of Thomas's arguments, and
Right.
it's very clear where he got them from.
Yep.
So that just suited my purposes, perfectly. And the I also thought by doing that, I would be able to show that Lutheran tradition is not one-dimensional. It's not just like
Right.
totally against everything medieval or everything that has to do with
Hmm.
Aristotle, right? So we have figures in our tradition who are very appreciative of scholastic theology, who were quite appreciative of Aristotle, thought that he was the best philosopher, right? So that's not something that's alien to our tradition or something that's totally unknown to it. It might be unknown to a lot of contemporary Lutherans because we live in we're very far removed from the age of scholasticism in the 17th century, and we are coming at the end of the 20th century, which was full of existentialism and approaches, neo-orthodoxy, and just approaches to theology that were very far removed from anything scholastic. So
Right.
for a lot of Lutherans, this is going to maybe sound weird or strange, but if you dig deeper and you go back farther, what you'll find is that Lutheran theology for about 200 years was very much in dialogue with medieval theology, with the church fathers, with classical sources. And so there's no reason why Lutherans today cannot also do that, cannot also be in dialogue with those things.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's why I loved what you had on Gerhard in there. I just finished reading Heinrich Schmid's Doctrinal Theology, and if you
Mhm.
think that Lutherans historically were not scholastic, I have a 700-page book for you. Um,
That's a great resource.
oh, it's a
One that
phenomenal resource.
every Lutheran should own, I think, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, what's nice is it's free online as well. I think it's public domain by now, but I know
It
Wolfmueller
is.
sells it. But
It is.
one thing I also really appreciated in your book that I've criticized apologetics as a movement broadly for this, but you do really well on this, is that a lot of apologists they'll tell you, okay, here's arguments for God, here is a basic argument for Christianity, have fun, go look for your theology elsewhere. But I believe it was the final chapter, one of the final chapters in your book, you gave a brief argument for Lutheranism, and I really appreciated that. I'm just curious, like what I suppose I could say, what inspired you to put that in there?
Well, like I said, it was written for Lutherans, and I
Hmm.
just felt like for the sake of completeness, we're not one thing that distinguishes Lutherans from a lot of other traditions is that um, our theology is distinctive, and it's also very hard for us to say anything that's not influenced by those distinctive elements of it. So, for example, for a Lutheran to write a theology book for Christians in general would be very difficult. Um, it's something that it's kind of too bad in a way because it would be nice to maybe attract some people through that means into Lutheranism. But if we're going to write about any topic, it's going to have to be shaped by what we believe about a number of things. And so there's no way for a Lutheran to write about anything without it being a Lutheran book or written from a Lutheran point of view, or written for Lutherans, I feel. So um, I couldn't, for example, if I were to write a book on ethics, it'd have to be a Lutheran ethics book. It couldn't be a Christian ethics
Yeah.
book, or it couldn't be a Protestant ethics book. It would have to be a Lutheran ethics book because our theology is defined enough and it's detailed enough that it influences almost everything that we say and everything that we believe. So there's no way to just kind of do lowest common denominator kind of theological writing when you're a Lutheran. You really have to, your Lutheranism is going to show up in different ways. And the point I'm seeking to make here is that with apologetics, I felt like it wouldn't really make sense to argue for like a mere Christianity. There are a lot of apologetics books that do that, right? They try to show that, or they argue for what people would consider the fundamentals, right? And there's nothing particularly wrong with that. But for a Lutheran, because the doctrine is so important, and because we want to make sure that we are, affirming everything that we believe and defending it publicly and things like that, it was important, I think, to say something about why it's important for these prior arguments to lead to Lutheranism. Why the understanding of the Bible and the understanding of Christ and the understanding of God that have so far been articulated, why there should be a natural progression from understanding those things to understanding that Lutheranism is biblical and is correct. So for me, that kind of had to be there as kind of like the coda, because otherwise I would feel like I wasn't really doing apologetics in a Lutheran way. I feel like to do apologetics in a Lutheran way, Lutheranism needs to be the conclusion to some extent. So, or in some sense. So the last chapter was basically designed so that people could answer the question, why am I a Lutheran? When people ask, like, why do you go to that church instead of some other church? They've already figured out why they should be Christian, but then, like you said, there's still a lot of options out there, right? And so that still leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And my thought was that I wanted to kind of steer people at the end to where I think, is the best place for them to be and the best place for them to go, which is the Lutheran tradition and Lutheran churches. So at the end, there's an argument for why someone who has accepted what is in the previous chapters of the book should then, on that basis, go to a Lutheran church. And the basic argument that I make is that we've seen that the Bible should be regarded as entirely truthful. Well, if that's the case, what follows from that for where we should go to church, right? What church actually teaches in a way that's completely consistent with what the Bible says? And I approach this in two ways. I first say, which churches have the gospel, or which churches teach that we are saved, by grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. And then I also ask, which churches also have a biblical view of the means of grace? Which churches understand properly how the gospel comes to us, or how it reaches us, and how it transforms us? And my view is that in the book, and of course elsewhere, is that only the Lutheran tradition gets both of these things right. So they get what the gospel is and what its content is. They get that correct, but then they also get the means of grace right. So they understand how the gospel comes to us correctly. And so it's the only tradition, in my view, that's completely consistent with what the Bible says on these matters. And that was, how I wrapped things up. That was what I think anyone should probably point to if they're ever asked, why are you Lutheran? I mean, they can say, well, because I think Lutherans believe what the Bible believes. That is more or less what I'm saying. But if they wanted to say something a bit more than that, if they wanted to elaborate on that, then they could say, well, I think the Lutheran Church understands the gospel correctly, understands that it's by grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. And they also understand how the gospel is delivered. They understand that it's through word and sacrament that we receive God's blessings and we receive the forgiveness of sins. So I figure, and I pointed out how other traditions fall short, in my view, on these matters, right? So some churches don't get the gospel right. Other churches are they more or less get the gospel right, or they tend to be in the right ballpark, you might say. But when it comes to the means of grace, then they fall flat on that. So my view is that only Lutheranism gets both of those things correct.
Yeah. And that's again something I really appreciated because it wasn't just, oh, I happen to be Lutheran and here are some nice things about it. It's no, here's a very, very brief but almost
Yeah.
systematic approach to it where it's
Right. I
like
mean, you could.
I mean, because if sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, like, that last chapter could have been a book by itself, of
Oh
course. And
yeah.
if
Oh
it was going to be
yeah.
thorough, it would have had to have been. But like I said, that my idea was just, I'm picturing like somebody talking, a layperson, right, talking to
Right.
somebody else who's also a Christian, perhaps, and goes to a different church, and they're asking, "Why do you go to this church?" Right? How? And I was thinking, how might they answer this question? I
Hmm.
don't want them saying things like the people are nice, right? That's not
Yeah.
what I think is a good answer. I don't want them to say I like Pastor John's preaching. I hope they do, but
Right.
that's once again not really a good answer.
Right.
Um, so it has to be about doctrine, right? And I want them to be able to point to the things in particular that most distinguish Lutheranism from a doctrinal standpoint, and most recommend it, in my view, as the tradition that Christians should be a part of.
Yeah. Yeah. That was that's the right way to look at it, I think. And I think as you've mentioned, that's the overall structure of the book in a sense. Or the overall I was about to say the essence of the book. It's as you mentioned, it's not something that like somebody who knows extensively about philosophy is going to get a ton out of this. They're going to get some methods. They're going to get some, I think, some general ideas as to how to approach things. But it's mostly for the layman,
It is,
and that's
I mean,
good.
yeah,
That's wonderful.
it's kind of like a collection of talking points, you might say. Like,
Yep.
I know that talking points are sometimes disparaged because they're kind of superficial, or because they don't necessarily, get to the heart of things, but they are effective oftentimes in
Right.
conversation, right? So I just want to plant these ideas in people's minds so that when hard, topics come up, when difficult discussions are had, they won't be like a deer in headlights. They won't be like, what do I say? They might, I mean, that might still happen, obviously, to some extent, but hopefully after reading the book, they'll feel at least a little bit equipped to deal with situations like that. And they won't just, be guessing or making things up, or just being silent because they have no idea what might be true or correct or helpful to say.
Yeah.
Like for example, I
Absolutely.
teach college classes, and like
Hmm.
I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, and so many kids that I teach, they just assume that you can't prove that God exists,
Hmm.
and because that they've heard that before, but they've never actually investigated it, right? They've never actually looked into it themselves. They've just heard that from different people, probably not people that they should necessarily be giving a lot of credence to, but it's something that they've absorbed. It's something they've soaked up, and so they get to my class and they feel pretty confident that that's the truth. But there's no good reason to think that. So I mean, there's historical explanations for why a lot of people think that today, but there's no good reason to think that's correct or true. So I was hoping that by reading this book, some people might realize that some of the things that they're inclined to think, or some of the things that they have often heard, maybe are not actually the best way of looking at things or thinking about things.
Hmm. And so a similar thought, we talk about how laymen, they should be equipped, but at the same time, they
Mhm.
don't need to be necessarily like experts on this. And so my question is, what do you, how do I say this? What are the philosophical presuppositions of an effective apologetics, and what do you think the role is of philosophy to apologetics for that matter?
Well, I think it's important that people are realists. And when I say realists, I mean realists about epistemology or about knowledge. Okay, so they think that there is an external world outside of our minds that is objectively there, and we can discover it and we can learn things about it, and our thoughts can represent it or correspond to it. I think it's important that they're realists about metaphysics, which means that they believe that there really are kinds of things like objectively present in the world, and the kind of thing that something is determines like what's suitable for it and what's appropriate or fitting for it. And then related to that, realists about morality. So they believe that there are objective truths about what is right and wrong and what people should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. So if you are a realist in those ways, I think that Christianity is going to come pretty easy. I think Christianity is a pretty natural fit for somebody who thinks that way, because Christianity does a great job of explaining how the world is that way and how we are that way as knowers and as moral beings. Christianity harmonizes with realism very well, and it's kind of hard to understand how realism would be true without Christianity or without at least certainly without theism, but I think without Christianity too. So if you're a realist about these things, then I don't think it's that difficult to see that Christianity is quite plausible and see that Christianity makes a lot of sense, see that Christianity has a lot of explanatory power, and that it can answer a lot of questions that we have about why the world is the way it is and why we are the way that we are. However, if somebody's not a realist, then Christianity is going to probably seem a lot less likely to be true to them, or it's going to have less to recommend it, because that natural fit's not going to be there between their assumptions about how the world is and what Christianity says is true, right? So if somebody is an anti-realist, and by that I mean that they're basically a subjectivist, they think that truth is pretty much in the eye of the beholder when it comes to certainly when it comes to like aesthetics or when it comes to morality, but even when it comes to facts about the physical world, right? They might think that also is really just dependent on someone's subjective impression or interpretation of things. All right, so somebody who thinks like a postmodernist or a Nietzschean or someone like that, they're going to have a really hard time seeing anything of value in Christianity, because Christianity doesn't line up at all with the way that they conceive of the world, right? There's not a world there that needs to be explained in the way that Christianity explains it, right? So there's an issue there, I think. People like that are, if you want to use like a medical analogy, they're in a lot worse state. Okay, they're very unhealthy. Okay, if we're going to look at it from a philosophical or from a cognitive or an ethical point of view, I'm going to say those people are very unhealthy. Spiritually, they're unhealthy too, of course. But I just think like from a philosophical point of view, they have some very mistaken ideas, and those people need a lot more attention and a lot more care to get them to see things from a Christian point of view, or to see the truth in Christianity. First of all, I think they really you need to point out that their anti-realism or their subjectivism, their skepticism, that these things are not tenable. And I think the best way to do that usually is just to point out that these people can't live consistently according to these beliefs, right? When you think that truth is totally up to the individual, or it's all in the eye of the beholder, or everything's relative, when you actually get it out into the world and you're living your life, you realize that you do need to believe that some things are objective and some things are out there and they're subject independent and they're external to you. And it's not all a matter of opinion. It's not all a matter of interpretation. You can't live consistently thinking that it is. Not only is it self-contradictory, right, to think that it's true that there are no truths. I mean, everybody has harped on that before, but you just can't go through the world thinking that there's no such thing as justice, for example, and yet still interacting with people and living your life in a way that leads to positive outcomes. So I just think that way of thinking, it's obviously very prevalent, but it tends to be superficial. It tends to be shallow. Most people, they pay it lip service because they hear it so much, but they don't live it out consistently, because I don't think anybody could. So it's like, the college student thinks everything's relative, but at the same time, they have very strong opinions about political issues, or about moral issues. So they're very inconsistent, right? Very self-contradictory in what they're saying and what they're thinking. Um, and one of the things that apologists has to do with people like that, I think the first thing they have to do is just kind of try to heal that inconsistency, right? Try to show that there's a real problem with thinking about the world in these terms, because it doesn't allow an integrated perspective on things. It doesn't allow you to be consistent in how you live your life and how you think about things and how you articulate your opinions or your viewpoints. Anti-realism doesn't really allow for that, in my view. So that's the first step, is just to kind of get people, I think, who have adopted that kind of postmodern skeptical relativism to realize that that actually doesn't make a lot of sense, and that you can't live that. You can't live according to those beliefs. And once you've done that, then I think it's possible to move them forward, and to get them to kind of see how a view that does take objective reality seriously, a view that does take morality seriously, how is such a view is made sense of by Christianity. So it's all about approaching people where they are, understanding where they need to go to get to the point where Christianity is actually going to start explaining things that they think need to be explained. You have to move them incrementally to that point, because I think a lot of people are so, lost and so confused about things, that the world as they see it is not the kind of thing that really needs an explanation, because they just think it's absurd. They think there's no like intelligibility to it. There's no order to it. And you need to point out or show them to the best of your ability that the world actually does evince a lot of order, and the world does have, it is intelligible. It does conform, or our thoughts, do conform to reality. And if we want to live successfully, we need to be objective, or have beliefs about these things being objective. So that's what I would say about that. It's about figuring out what someone needs to believe, so that Christianity then can start being the answer to their questions. They need to start asking the right questions first, though.
I think that's a really, really good discussion of such a good overview of it, because I think a lot of people, it depends on where you are, but the average person, I feel like, who's working now, not necessarily a college student, the average person who's lived a life so far, maybe they have like at least some kids, maybe they're married, they aren't going to be actually saying truth is subjective. But a lot of my experience, because I'm only 23, in college, I ran into that kind of stuff a ton. These absurdists, for example, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
absurdists, and those I don't know if they'd be kind of like moral nihilists, I think is the right term. I could be wrong. But point is, I think that's a good approach to it, because a lot of people, and I fall into this trap myself, a lot of people just say, okay, let me just build up this incredible argument and just throw it at somebody and say, here you go, instead of
Mm-hmm.
like meeting them where they are, trying to understand why they believe what they do and see, well, are you living consistently with this?
Right. Right.
Um, yeah, and like this, I mean, I did give these people arguments, but a lot of the time, honestly, this is just my experience. Something that has moved a lot of the people that I know, who were once hostile to Christianity, to a less hostile form of it, or at least ambivalent, maybe even, they're leaning in the direction of it being true, is just meeting people who are Christian who are actually pretty intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
And then that may seem a little superficial, almost silly, but I think there's often a look at religion, especially from new atheists, or the new atheist movement, that says, "Oh, all people who like, I mean, religion is just this fairy tale. All people who believe it are just deluded." But if you run into somebody who knows even
Mm-hmm.
the basics of, say, apologetics or philosophy, some people are just taken aback by that. Whether or not they actually think the arguments work, they say, "Wait, maybe it's not completely idiotic. Maybe there's something to it, and I should investigate this more thoroughly." So,
Yeah, I
yeah.
agree. I mean, when I was in my early 20s, I was not a believer at that point.
Mhm.
And one of the things that got me to come back, or got me to start thinking about Christianity again, was just discovering intelligent Christians out there. Not to say that the people that were in my church when I grew up were not intelligent, but that was an aspect of Christianity, or a part of it, that I didn't really experience. It just didn't make an impression
Right.
on me. If it was there, I didn't see it, and it didn't really register with me.
Hmm.
There were probably people in my church that were like, well read in theology, and maybe like could have discipled me or mentored me in, a lot of ways, but I didn't know about that. That wasn't something that I was
Right.
conscious of. So, and that's one reason why I think, churches maybe should think a lot about, if they have people like that in their congregations, like giving young people a chance to like talk with them at different times, because I think that
Yep.
that might be very helpful. Because I didn't, my experience was that Christians are just not really interested in intellectual things. Um, and then, and that wasn't, the sole reason, or even probably the primary reason why I stopped going to church, but it did make, that was the impression I had, for sure. And
Yep.
I did think that I was in part justified by not belonging to a church or not going to church,
Hmm.
because I don't want to be the kind, that kind of person that doesn't think about things, or doesn't, isn't very intelligent, or whatever. That was,
Hmm.
I think, an excuse that I used myself to kind of rationalize why I wasn't going, or why I
Hmm.
was no longer involved, is because there were not people there that I thought um, were just, there was a lack of curiosity, or there was a lack of
Right.
interest in intellectual things, and it seemed like these people didn't necessarily have good reasons for what they believed, and certainly none that I had, you know been told about. So
Yeah.
I'm in my early 20s, and I discover, for like the first time really, um, academic theology, and the fact that there are people out there like William Lane Craig who, we can criticize a lot of things that he says, and that he believes, but nobody can deny that he's a brilliant guy, right?
Oh, he's
So
intelligent. He's
yeah,
very
he's
smart.
he's as smart as they come. So just realizing that people like that are out there who do believe things that are very similar to what the people in my, that church back home believed, um, that was a revelation for me. And
Yep.
that definitely softened my resistance to Christianity, because I was like, well, maybe this whole like idea of like being an intellectually curious person who wants to have reasons for believing things, and being a Christian, maybe those things are not incompatible, right? Maybe those, you can
Hmm.
actually do both and have both. Um, so just realizing that, and having that kind of, in my face, made a huge difference, I think, just to how I saw my possibilities, or saw what was possible for me, or what was, um, just what the future might hold. At that point, ever since then, basically, I've just been studying theology nonstop. And that was a big part of what got me to do that, was just realizing, oh, wait, there's actually this intellectual tradition in Christianity, this amazing, massive tradition of reflection, and intelligent commentary, and intelligent discussion and inquiry in the history of Christianity, and all kinds of things. And that's like this mine, right? This gold mine that's just waiting there for you to like start mining it, and you'll never run out of things to discover, and to think about, and to learn, and to study. And when I realized that, it's like my perception of Christianity changed a lot, just through that realization. So all that to say, you're certainly right. Getting a dose of intelligent Christianity, getting a dose of what you might call thinking man's Christianity, right? Christianity from people
Sure.
that think about it carefully. That's probably sufficient, right? Just people who think about it carefully, who care about having the right beliefs, care about the truth, care about making sure that what they believe has some kind of reasoning behind it, or some kind of support, right, that they can point to, people who care about the why question, right? As soon as you realize that that exists, it certainly can change everything.
Oh, absolutely. I had a not quite your journey. I was never quite an atheist. I always went to church. I was becoming more of a fideist, though. I was definitely in that crowd of people that's like, you can't say that
Mm-hmm.
God exists. You can't prove it. At least I took it by faith, and I said, at best, you could be like, oh, I these experiences that I've had seem divine of some sort. And I can't exactly remember like how I got there, but I basically discovered some stuff from Aquinas, and uh, it was Aquinas, and then from there actually led me to Lutheranism because I said, okay, maybe these older guys know what they're talking about. I started reading church fathers, and here I am. But um, yeah, and one thing that's been disappointing for me was not as a Lutheran, but this was when I was an evangelical. Was now this is not the case with all evangelicals. I know a ton of evangelicals who are brilliant on apologetics and philosophy. Southern Evangelical Seminary has some wonderful
Mm-hmm.
stuff coming out of there. But when I was an evangelical, at least the circles that I was in, it was very almost anti-intellectual. Um, it was very like when I started investigating this stuff and started asking questions. I mean, it's almost like around me, a lot of people didn't ask those questions. Maybe I just didn't meet the right people. But I remember being almost discouraged from doing this because I started to make some doctrinal statements. I'm like, wait, given these philosophical things, and given that we need to make this a system, here are some theological things I'm curious about. People are like, well, divisions, all this stuff doesn't. No, we shouldn't do that. Like, especially when I started affirming divine simplicity, I was people really didn't like that. It's like, oh, you're just, this is some obscure doctrine, this obscure
Yeah.
idea that's old that it doesn't really matter. Um, Point is, though, I think that a lot of churches are getting better about that across all denominations, from my experience. But it was still a thing and something we should avoid, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know if it has something to do with the internet or not, but I think churches used to be more isolated, and Christians certainly used to be more isolated.
Hmm.
And so, it wasn't like I feel like today it'd probably be a lot harder to kind of have this impression that Christianity is this like monolithic thing, or that Christianity is very one dimensional, or the
Right,
Christianity the Christianity that you experienced in church is like that's all there is out there.
right.
Because there's so many, you're getting in so many different windows opening on different things, right? So you're seeing lots of things just through your, online media feeds or whatever that Christians 30 years ago were not seeing, right? So
Right.
I think for that reason, it really is quite different. And I think it'd be a lot harder to have the impression today, if you really pay any attention, that
Hmm.
Christianity um, has no like intellectual aspect to it, or there's no like
Right.
nothing there for more I don't know what you want to say,
Hmm.
but people who are more bookish and more interested in arguments and things like that. So
Hmm.
um, there's a lot out there. I certainly think that if you have any curiosity at all, you're going to be able to find those things, even because
Right.
even mainstream outlets like the Gospel Coalition or whatever, they publish things on a regular basis that would kind of make it clear to you that there are Christian scholars out there, there are Christian,
Right.
intellectuals that you could pay attention to and read. Um,
Hmm.
Going back to the fideism thing briefly,
Yeah.
one of the things that I think attracts people to fideism is that people like the idea that Christianity is the kind of thing that you can't really argue for or against, because if that's the case, then it really just leaves it totally up to them, what they're going to believe.
Hmm.
And I think that people like that kind of autonomy, or that feeling of autonomy that comes with fideism, because like my decisions or my beliefs don't have to be constrained by reality. They can just be, it's just all a
Yep.
matter of what I prefer to think, right? And people
Practically.
can't
Yep.
criticize it. I can't offer reasons for it, but nobody can criticize it either. And I'm just going to do my thing. And if people don't like it, that's fine. But ultimately, it leaves the person in the driver's seat about what truth is and what they're going to be
Hmm.
committed to. And I think that for modern people, I think that's that's very attractive. So I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things that, I'm not saying that was true in your case, but I think
No.
for a lot of people, I think that is kind of the attraction of fideism, or at least part
Mhm.
of it.
Yeah, in my case, it was kind of a pessimism. That was when I was reading a lot of that was when I was really end of high school, right before college, so like senior year of high school, when I was just encountering things that I wasn't really used to, and I was really dissatisfied, honestly, by a lot of the standard apologetic answers. I'll put
Hmm.
it that way. Um, in retrospect, a lot of them were better than I thought they were. I didn't just understand them that well, but
Yeah,
I
it
hadn't
happens.
investigated enough. But um, one thing, yeah, with fideism, I think also it kind of depends who you're talking to, but with some fideists, it's almost you're right, it is something about not being able to attack it. But it also
Hmm.
is, I get this language of, oh, I don't want to put God in a box. If I can reason to God, then
Hmm.
that's not truly God. God is above reason, is a lot
Right.
of the language I hear. But that's just not the language of Scripture at all. Of course, Romans 1, and that's the classic
Yeah.
of, well, we
Well, that's
see
another thing
things
too.
around us. Say it again?
Fideism oftentimes seems to be connected to this like very strong kind of apophaticism, or this like
Yes.
idea that like we can't really get clear about a lot of things, right? Or we can't.
Right.
And what you see then is that there's kind of a convergence between fideism and skepticism,
Yeah.
right? There's a
Yeah.
they really go together quite well, um, because the fideist is basically claiming that they're skeptical about the reasons that people can offer, either for or against.
Hmm.
Um, but that ends up kind of making you feel like you don't really have a good grip, or a good grasp of the truths that you do claim to believe. I feel like
Right.
your grasp on those things is going to feel very tenuous, um,
Hmm.
and almost like it's just something you're making up, right?
Right.
um, so I think that a lot of people, fideism, I think, does tend to, oftentimes those people do end up kind of leaving the faith at some point, because
Hmm.
there's so little that's actually holding them, um,
Right.
in place, or holding them in the church. It's just kind of you know, their own will, or their own, subjective desires for what they would like to be true,
Right.
what they hope is true. Um, but if those feelings or those desires change at all, then what's to keep them there? There's nothing outside of themselves that's going to be reminding them, or pushing them to stay. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I don't think of fideism as being very spiritually healthy.
No,
Um,
it's not. Yeah. One thing that um, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I remember. One thing I encounter with a lot of fideists or skeptics is a lot of the time they're inconsistent on this, where it's like, oh, they're super skeptical of, these metaphysical questions that
mhm,
concern God, but when you get into questions about other things that say are metaphysical, it's, oh yeah, there's reasons for this. I can use my reason to reason. Uh,
right.
and it's not, again, it's not always inconsistent. They may give arguments as to why God is a special case, but from my experience, I don't run into people that are able to do that too much. So,
Yeah, it does seem like there's
yeah.
some picking and choosing going on, some
Oh
special
yeah.
pleading. Yeah.
And
Um, and
yeah. So,
when
oh,
you
sorry, go.
kind of try to denigrate, I mean, reason should be denigrated in certain
Right.
circumstances or situations, but when you just do it in general, um, regardless of context, regardless of situation or what's being discussed, um, you're probably not going to have very consistent views about anything,
Right.
because that's just not
Yeah.
something that you obviously care to make an effort regarding.
Hmm. And I think one thing that's interesting here is this really shows us a lot of the opposition, as I said, to Christianity, or to a lot of the skepticism. Oftentimes is just it's inconsistent, and a lot of the time it almost comes, not always, I want to be clear here, but a lot of the time
Mhm.
it almost is a hard-heartedness. And with that in mind, what do you think the role of apologetics is in general, especially in the context of monergism? And you mentioned this very briefly in the book, but I'd
Mhm.
love to discuss a little more, because we talk about how, well, as Lutherans, we don't believe in decision theology. We have a specific view of regeneration where the Holy Spirit has to work. There's, the call, illumination, regeneration, conversion, all of that the Holy Spirit does. And so what really is the role of apologetics, especially with the unbeliever?
That's a good question. One of the primary objections to apologetics, at least as it's typically practiced, is that it's not consistent with election. It's not consistent with a monergistic view of conversion. So the idea is that it's Arminian in some sense, right? Or it's Roman Catholic. Yeah. It's premised on this idea that people have the freedom to respond or not respond to the kinds of arguments that are being made. And so there are people that would think that, apologetics has really no place, or there are people that rethink apologetics and take it in different directions so that, they kind of treat non-believers as being like sub-rational or something. And I'm still not sure how that is supposed to work, how you're supposed to do apologetics if you don't think that there's anything that you share in common with believers, at least
Oh yeah.
insofar as
I
the
had a
believers
I had a
say.
whole hour I had like an hour video on presuppositionalism, and you've discussed that a lot with me.
Right,
But
right.
yeah,
So,
go on.
but leaving that aside, because that's a whole other can of worms.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other topic.
I don't, I think there's a very easy way to understand how apologetics works. It might not be totally obvious, but I think once you think about it, then you can see how it makes sense and how it's really not in any way a problem for somebody who affirms a Lutheran view of conversion. So what apologetics does, first of all, we're not going to say that apologetics works apart from the Spirit or works independently from the Spirit. Everybody who becomes a Christian, every step they take towards becoming a Christian is a step that was Spirit led or Spirit directed. So the only steps that are not are the ones where they're walking away in some way, right? They're moving in the other direction. So everything they do that leads them to become a Christian, the Spirit's empowering that, and the Spirit's behind it. And that starts a long time sometimes before they ever hear the word, right? Or before they're ever baptized. There's going to be other things happening in the background before those things happen that make those things possible, right? There's going to be these preliminary things that are going to occur, and they're going to make it so that that person can hear the word, or that person can be brought to be baptized. And apologetics, in my view, is one of those things that happen in the background, one of those things that form a preliminary step to getting people to hear the word. So what I would say is that what an apologist is doing is they are with the Spirit's leading and empowerment, they are helping somebody to get to the point where they are willing to listen and hear the word. They are willing to take Christianity seriously enough to engage with it. They are willing to, I'm not saying, like I said, I'm not saying that the person who is being mentored by the apologist or who is being spoken to by the apologist, I'm not saying that that person is doing this by their own power or through their own will. I'm saying that the Spirit is using these arguments, using the apologetic discussion to move them in this direction, is softening their heart, is changing their mind, getting them to see things in a different way. And because of that, then they are receptive to the word, able to pay attention to it, able to take it seriously and not just resist it and refuse to pay any attention to it. So that's what I would say apologetics does. It doesn't convert anybody, but it does operate in the background to create these preliminary conditions that are necessary for someone to listen to God's word and to take it seriously and to heed it. And I don't see anything about that is inconsistent with monergism or with a Lutheran view of conversion. I think it all totally fits together. If you're going to say that a neighbor can help, by, I don't know, helping somebody build their garage, if you can say that that person's interactions with a person we're able to get them into church, and then we're able to get them to hear the word, and then we're able to get them to be a believer, I don't see why we can't say the same thing about apologetics. So any interaction, any relationship, any of those things can be means. Any conversation can be a
Yeah.
means to get somebody into church and get somebody to be reading their Bible. And apologetics is just one of those types of conversations. And for a certain type of person, it might be a type of conversation that that person needs. So some people don't need apologetics. At least they don't, it doesn't have much of a role to play in their deciding to go to church and then, heed what the pastor has to say and take it to heart. But other people do, right? Especially people who have, for whatever reason in their background, they have unanswered questions about the truth of Christianity, right? Or they have doubts, or they are unsure of which religion is true, or things like that. So for people like that, apologetics might be one of those conversations, one of those preliminary things that is able to get them to open their hearts and to at least take heed of what God is saying through the pastor and through the word.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And I think this especially fits with Lutheran theology
Mm-hmm.
because as Lutherans, we affirm, and you mentioned it in the book, of course, God's use of means of grace. And I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
say apologetics is a means of grace, but the general concept of a means, right? Of
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
using means for things. And I think when we remove the layer, like some people, as Lutherans, when we see the means of grace, baptism and the Eucharist, and I mean, I know the debates of the other whether what is it, absolution and ordination, all that stuff, but at least baptism and the Eucharist, the main sacraments, I think, or the major ones, I think, as Lombard would say. I think when we remove the notion of, well, it's not that God is restricted by the sacraments, it's that God has promised these things specially, but God promising those things doesn't mean that God can't use something else to
Right.
at least lead them there. um
Right.
and
So we want
so
to say God works
yeah,
through secondary causes all the time, right? And a secondary cause is
yeah,
just something in the world that makes something else happen, right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
how does God, right? So when we're physically ill, how does God meet our needs? Well, through medicine, right? Through healthcare, through
Yep.
doctors and nurses. Um, so God uses all kinds of means, not just, he's not limited to the means of grace. He
Right.
uses all kinds of means. And I believe there are means that he uses prior to the means of grace to get us to be in the vicinity of those means or get us to
Absolutely.
be in a place where we can experience those means. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, that's what apologetics is in my point of view. And I don't, the idea that that's in some way inconsistent with our theology doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. I agree. And I've long said to people, I said, if everybody could understand secondary causality, I
Mm-hmm.
genuinely think the world would look a lot different. Because secondary causality
Mm-hmm.
is a whole, like, it opens up a lot of metaphysical ideas. It opens up the role of apologetics. It opens up
Mm-hmm.
one's proper understanding of theology with means of grace and against things like the prosperity gospel, or health and wealth. At least I think it does a ton.
Right.
But that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
And so with this in mind, when you go about apologetics, I know there are different people and different arguments work on some people and other arguments on others. I'm curious. So what argument do you particularly like? And are there any arguments that you really don't like or you don't think are effective or even sound for that matter?
Okay. Um, I think the best arguments are cosmological arguments. Those have always resonated the most with me. They've always seemed the most plausible and the most difficult to avoid the conclusions for. Um, Particularly, the um, argument for motion, the argument to a first cause, um, the contingency argument. I think those are all good arguments.
Hmm.
I like the design argument. it depends to some extent on how it's articulated, but I think in general it's a perfectly fine argument. It's a good argument. I think you look outside, you look in the world, you see order everywhere, right? And
Hmm.
order, in my view, is something that needs to be explained. It's not
Hmm.
something that you get for free,
Do
right?
you
It's
mean
something.
Aquinas' fifth way, or do you mean like the
I
standard
am
design
talking about
argument of
that. No,
now?
I am talking primarily about the fifth way. I think
Oh, okay.
I prefer that view or that understanding of the argument to like a watchmaker type argument. Like
I agree. I was just wanted to clarify.
okay, sure. Um, but yeah, I just think that all those arguments are good. The ones that kind of take some general feature of the world and show that it's inexplicable without God, right? And that's what all those arguments seek to do. I think they're all very strong. I think that the only way you can really avoid them, the conclusion, in my view, is by denying principles that you would affirm in every other context, basically, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
for example, the principle of causality, right? That's something I think everybody believes, except when they see an argument for God's existence, and they're like, "Well, I don't know about that."
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that those arguments are really good. The moral argument, I think, is fine. I think if you are committed, if you are honest with yourself, you're going to admit that that you are a realist about morality. I think that everybody is, you might say, deep down inside, and there are people that deny it. I have a hard time thinking that everybody really believes it, believes in moral nihilism, as you called it earlier. I think
Yeah.
everybody does believe that there are objective moral truths on some level, and I think that um, that usually becomes apparent in situations where they feel like they've been grievously wronged somehow, right? Or somebody that they care about has been grievously wronged. Um, then they're no longer skeptics about morality, right? So I think the moral argument's good. I don't really see any explanation for objective morality apart from theism. Um, I think I've always liked the argument from desire or from longing
Yep.
that you find in like
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, and it goes back to Augustine, of course.
Yeah.
Um,
And Aquinas has a version of it too in his Summa,
yep,
I think.
yep. So that one, I don't know that I don't think it's as impressive or as philosophically rigorous as or strong as the others, but for me personally, it strikes a chord. It just, it's something
Right.
that makes sense to me on some kind of deep level. So I've always felt like the world doesn't provide anything that's fully satisfactory, right?
Hmm.
And for that, but I also feel like it wouldn't make sense to have a desire for something beyond that if there was no such thing. So
Right.
I do feel like that desire is implanted, or that the desire for God is something that we all have, and I think it's evidence that God exists. So I think those are probably the primary ones that I am particularly fond of. There's a lot, and there are others that I probably would also affirm. I mean, I think Aquinas' fourth way is a good argument too. I
Hmm.
think it'd be harder for a lot of people to wrap their minds around or
Same with the
to
third.
understand it. What do you say?
The third one as well. The third
The
way,
third,
like
yeah,
you have to know a lot about generation and corruption, and there's one
right,
premise in there that's like you really have to defend, but
yeah. I actually think that's the weakest of the five ways. The third one.
that's interesting. My hot take is the first is,
Oh, really?
but
Okay.
yeah, yeah, that's I won't get into it too much, but I think that you have to spend a lot of time dealing with physics. You have to spend a
Hmm.
ton of time dealing with that and being like, here's how it works with like the various understandings of time. Here's how it works with like gravity. Here's how it works with a ton of other
Right.
stuff. And so, in my sense, I'm not saying it's unsound. For me, weakness is not just does it work, but also how much work do you have to throw into it to make
Right.
it make
Right.
sense?
I can see what you're
So,
saying. Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Yeah. I feel like that probably the most straightforward one is the second way, right? I mean, that's the one
yep.
that's probably going to
Yep.
be the easiest to explain and the one that people will be able to
Yep.
grasp most quickly.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
I wasn't really going to say anything, but just that um, I think the fourth is similar to the first in that sense that you were just
Yeah.
describing, and that I think it's a good argument. I think that for modern people who don't think of there being degrees of being, and it's not like a
Oh yeah.
natural a way that they typically perceive the world. I think that something either exists or it doesn't, right? And they don't think of
Yeah.
existence as coming in grades. Um, for that, for a modern person, the fourth way might seem a bit counterintuitive, but I think it's also a good
Yeah.
argument once you understand the premises, and once if you are able to understand like what's motivating them, or why
Right.
they are why they should be seen as true.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And my experience, I remember, I laugh about this all the time. I have a ton of experiences in college of just stupid things.
Mhm.
But I just remember I was taking like an anthro class or something like that. I was not a major, it was just a gen ed I took. I remember the
Mhm.
professor saying that Aristotle's chain of being goes against evolution. It was clearly because she didn't understand the distinction of formal and efficient causes. Whether we want to
Mhm.
discuss evolution, right now, that's a whole other topic. But point is, like, even assuming evolution is true, that doesn't eliminate a chain of being on a formal level. I was just
Yeah.
really embarrassed by it. And one thing that I
Yeah.
find,
Mhm.
I find that a lot of the time, like you mentioned, I'm not a big fan of like the watchmaker argument too much, at least in itself. I don't think that it works as well when it comes to like establishing God's existence, because I just don't like arguments from probability much. I just don't. Because it's usually like, oh, it's super improbable that all these things would be this way. Therefore, it's
Mhm.
more
Right.
likely that's gonna. I'm not a fan of that. But I do think that arguments like that are helpful with establishing actually the divine attributes. I think it helps establish
Mhm.
like, okay, there is an aspect of care, like
Mhm.
basically against deism. It works a good
Right.
polemic, surprisingly, in that respect. And I've had people like I've been trying to think of a formulation out of it, out of like music or beauty. And I should mention, some people have asked me before. I speak of music a lot. That's because the background, that huge bag, that's a tuba. But
Okay.
like as a musician, I
Mhm.
found a lot of beauty in it. Like I listen to a lot of orchestral works, and I think to
Mhm.
myself, this shows to me a significant degree of order in the world.
Yeah.
And so I don't use that in itself, but I think it's good to establish divine attributes at the least, or the nature of God is caring about the world, so to speak.
Mhm. I agree. I think, yeah, I would rather argue from general features of the world instead of
Absolutely.
something very specific,
Yeah.
because like you said, the problem with the watchmaker argument, it's like, how complicated does something need to be, right?
Yeah.
Before it's clear that it needs some kind of designer. But if you just operate on the level of principles, like, does order itself, is that something that can be explained without some kind of source, or is that something that could
Yep.
exist, I should say, without some kind of intelligence, right? Can order exist without an
Right.
orderer? And if we stay at that level, I think most people are going to hold that the idea of getting order from nothing, or getting order for nothing, doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Right.
So you don't get order from chaos. It just doesn't make sense that chaos would produce order, because chaos doesn't possess order to give,
Right.
right? So if you've got order in the world, then you need some kind of explanation, and that has to be something intelligent, because only intelligence can actually produce order, is what I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, and one thing that you made me think of earlier was you talked about how a lot of the time people deny certain, I suppose you could say, premises for arguments only because they're used to argue for God. It makes me think of, now you could debate as to Leibniz's form of the principles of efficient reason. I think
Mhm.
Alexander Proust, I can't remember the exact formulation. It's Proust, so he writes it super mathematically. But
Right.
he has a really good formulation with Rob Koons as to a restricted principle of sufficient reason, where he
Hmm.
says, like, this is all you need to establish these other things. But the reason I say that is I find a lot of people that they're like, oh yeah, brute facts are true. Brute facts exist, things that just are the way they are for whatever reason,
Hmm.
but they only operate that way when it comes to metaphysics and God's existence. When you ask them questions about, there's a guy who's sick and you say, oh, what's
Hmm.
wrong with him? It's
Right.
not, he's just this way for no reason.
Yeah.
There is a reason this occurred.
Yeah, they never deny it in everyday life, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Or
It's
they never
something.
affirm brute facts in everyday life. It's always everything
Exactly.
has an explanation, has some kind of reason behind it.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's just when you meet people like that. Same with like postmodernists and relativists and things like that. I think the ad hominem consistency argument is probably
Yeah.
the best you can do. Just point out that
Absolutely.
seems like you're not being totally consistent, and they might not respond well to that, but
Right.
that's the first thing that they need to do is to start
Hmm.
getting consistent, because until consistency is happening in their thinking, they're not going to really see a need for the explanations that Christianity can offer, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's right.
Christianity explains a world that is orderly and harmonious and integrated and consistent. Um,
Hmm.
and so they need to start thinking in those ways before they're going to start understanding God's role in everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and I just have one final question for you.
Mhm.
Um, it's been great having you on here. Uh, so your book, as mentioned, I'm just going to show it up again. Um, this is obviously one of a ton of books, and I know you're obviously very well read on this, and I've read my fair share. Um, are there any books outside of yours that you recommend specifically that for various things, perhaps theology or perhaps philosophy, but um, I'm mostly thinking apologetics here.
Okay.
Are there any other books that you really appreciate and recommend to people?
Well, I would say if you want to understand the philosophical background of the book I wrote, and we talked about
Hmm.
this earlier, the Thomism behind it.
Yep.
Edward Fazer is the person to go to, because he has just written the most clear, the most accessible, the most easy to read books on Thomism that are out there, I think.
Yep.
Um, so his Aquinas for Beginners, best place to go probably. His
I agree.
Scholastic Metaphysics, great place to go.
Hmm.
Everything he does is great. I think that he's Roman Catholic, so obviously he's not going to, be affirming everything that we would want to affirm or agreeing with us on everything. But he agrees with us on everything that is really pertinent to these kinds of
Yep.
conversations or these discussions. So he's a great person to learn from, and you will learn. I mean, I don't see how anybody could fail to learn who comes to his books with a willingness to
Right.
study them, because he's such a master teacher and he is
Oh,
so
he's
good
so
at
good.
explaining things and elucidating
Yep.
things.
Yeah.
So I recommend Fazer for Thomism. For apologetics in general, um, there are so many books out there. I think that the apologists that have excited me the most and moved me the most and just kind of opened my eyes to what apologetics can be at its best. I'm going to say C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to say Peter Kreeft.
Oh,
Now,
Peter Craigs. Interesting.
Peter Kreeft is a professor of philosophy at
Yep.
Boston College. He's
Mm.
retired now. He's written a ton of books, and um, he's very much influenced by Lewis and by Aquinas. He's a Roman
Yep.
Catholic, and by Tolkien, and um, just the Western tradition in general. I would say. I mean, he's very knowledgeable about everything. In the history of Western civilization, as far as the intellectual history goes. Um, but he is what I like about both Lewis and Kreeft, and what I see that they share in common is that they have a very expansive view of what apologetics is and can be, like a much more
Mhm.
expansive view than I take in that book that I wrote, which was kind of a nuts and bolts kind of bare
Yeah.
bones
It says
take.
introduction.
It says
Just an
introduction, right?
introduction. Yeah.
But if you look at they attack apologetics from both like they have rational considerations, they have aesthetic considerations, they have
Oh
existential
yeah.
considerations. Um, and I just think they do a masterful job of just showing how Christianity kind of illuminates every aspect of life, right? So the theoretical, the practical, the ethical, the aesthetic, the just every different area of life. Christianity sheds light on it and makes sense of it in a way that non-Christian perspectives don't. And I think that both of them are very masterful at that. So Lewis, of course, has Mere Christianity, which is like his classic apologetics book, but it's really his whole body of work, I think, is apologetic in a lot of ways. It's trying to show how Christianity opens up or sheds light on life, right? How it makes sense of it all. And Kreeft does the same thing in a lot of his books. He wrote a handbook. I think it's called a Handbook of Christian Apologetics. It was co-authored with another guy. I think his name was Taselli. I might be wrong, but that's a really good resource. It's a really good resource. And I appreciate both of them too, because their philosophical perspective is a classical one. So both Lewis and Kreeft are approaching this from the point of view that classical philosophy from Plato to Aquinas is more correct than modern philosophy, right? So, and I think that's true. And because they have that perspective, which doesn't say they haven't learned a lot from modern philosophers or from, analytic philosophers or whatever, but I think both of them would say that like their thought is rooted in this pre-modern perspective on the world.
Absolutely.
And how it works, how it operates, how it's structured. And because of that, I think that their apologetics and their thought in general is just more consonant and more in line with the views that I myself have and think are most helpful. And I think, I was talking about how they're able to show how Christianity sheds light on everything. Well, I think one of the reasons why they're able to do that so effectively and so well is because they're committed to this pre-modern, perspective on the world. They have this pre-modern metaphysics, this pre-modern ethics, this pre-modern epistemology that I think enables that. So I think that classical philosophy and Orthodox Christianity just go hand in hand. I think that it's like hand in glove. They fit together very well, which is why this whole synthesis happened during the patristic period between classical culture and the church, and the theology of the Bible, because these things were seen to have a lot of congruence, a lot of points of contact. And I think that if you try to modern philosophy, because of its assumptions, I just don't think it connects nearly as well with the theological beliefs of Orthodox Christianity. So liberal Christianity, sure, I think that's probably a much better fit for liberal Christianity. But since we don't want to be that, and we don't want to be, people that don't believe in what God has revealed, I think we should be looking to pre-modern theologians for inspiration and for guidance when it comes to these things.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on here. This was Nathan Greeley, the author of Christian Apologetics, a Lutheran Introduction, which you can get. Earlier I was typing. You can get this for it says $14 on Amazon for print, and you can get it for $9 or $10 Kindle, at least on Amazon. So the book, I highly recommend it. I've already recommended it to several pastors and their parishioners. And I think everybody should read it, even if you are more familiar with philosophy. I know I actually got a solid amount out of this book, so everybody should take it. Thanks again for joining us. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. I always have a great time talking to you. So,
all right.
See you
bye,
later.
everybody.
Have fun. Bye.